Welcome to the third webinar in our 2019 series, Speaking of Nonprofit Boards. This afternoon, we've invited APG President and CEO, Mim Shirk, to share about her experience leading and observing productive board meetings. We'll have a 20-minute presentation by Mim, followed by some time for questions. You may submit your questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce you to Mim. Prior to her position as APG President, Mim served as the Senior Vice President of MHS for 21 years. During her tenure at MHS, she consistently put members first and was involved in shifting the organization toward a more member-driven approach. She assisted in restructuring the board to be rostered by 50% member-elected directors and engaged members at an annual MHS members meeting that drew over 100 attendees. Mim is rooted in Anabaptist values and beliefs and shares her deep knowledge about the various Anabaptist denominational groups when she gets the chance. Thank you for sharing with us today, Mim. Take it away.
Thank you, Twyla. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm looking forward to talking with you today about leading a productive board meeting. What I have to share with you is drawn from my 20+ years with MHS, where I attended many board meetings, and from my experience actually serving as a board member. As Twyla said, I'll talk for about 20 minutes and with time at the end to answer questions. So please, if I brush by something that you'd like to know something more about, feel free to ask the question via the chat function. Having productive board meetings is important in my view because board work is group work. Most of the work of nonprofit boards happens in the boardroom. This is where the collective wisdom and expertise of the board members is brought together to set the organization's culture and strategic direction. So making the most of each board meeting is critical for engaging the board and for tapping their best contribution when they're together face to face. So what does a productive board meeting look like? Here's what I think are the main components of a good meeting. Number one, it's clear from the agenda what the main topics and actions of the meeting will be, and there's good supporting documentation. Second, the board's meeting starts and ends on time. Third, the chair and the executive assume that board members have read the material and don't spend time repeating what's already in the packet. Fourth, there aren't last-minute agenda items or extra reading material that are handed out in the meeting. And fifth, every board member participates actively and shows their engagement. So that's my picture of the kind of board meeting that I like to be a part of. So let's take a look at 3 P's for having productive meetings: planning, process, and participation. The first is planning. Establishing the agenda sets the foundation for the meeting. And typically, the board chair and the executive together would identify key items that need the board's attention. And with each item, think about, is this an item that is for board's awareness and education? Is this something that you want the board's input in order to give some direction or parameters to, or feedback to staff? Or is this an item that needs action? The discipline of thinking through the purpose of each agenda item helps determine whether the item belongs on the consent agenda in some cases, or how much time is needed on the agenda for the board's participation. The next step, once you know what the agenda items are, is to identify the supporting documentation that's needed for each item. And of course, doing the planning well in advance of the meeting gives adequate time for the documentation to be prepared. And then finally, once the agenda's been assembled, you know what the main items are, then you can allocate time for each agenda item based on the complexity of the topic. A tip is to have a calendar and keep track of recurring items. MHS board uses a monitoring tool to keep track of when the board needs to sign things like the conflict of interest disclosure forms, or when the 990 needs to be approved, or maybe to keep track of when board terms are ending, or other types of board business that are recurring. To have a document where you can refer back to that, then you know in advance at each meeting what are those items that need to be addressed. And that is one tool that helps to keep from having last minute surprise items that you forgot about. In its 2017 National Index of Nonprofit Board Practices, BoardSource found that board chairs believe a board's impact on organizational performance is directly affected by the board receiving the information it needs in advance of the board meetings. It was interesting that BoardSource found that executives placed less emphasis on the importance of the board materials than the board chairs did. And this finding suggests that executives and board chairs would be wise to take a look at whether the materials are adequately equipping the board. It's a good question to be asking. And I'll reference later the board self-assessment tool is one opportunity for you to ask that question. So the first P, good planning, results in a thoughtful agenda and good supporting material, and having that sent to the board members well in advance so that they have good amount of time to review it. You need to keep in mind board members are generally busy people, often working, and so ideally board members would have at least a weekend, ideally a week in advance to receive the packet and have a chance to review it. The second P for good productive meetings is process. First, start and end on time. This is one for some reason I'm particularly attached to. There are rare and unusual circumstances when the meeting maybe cannot stick to the schedule, but as a rule, board members should be able to count on what time the meeting will start and especially what time the meeting will end. There are some cultures where it might be important to talk about what on time means. For some boards, the social gathering time may actually be considered an important component of the board meeting itself. So it's important for each board to agree on what on time means for your board. A second process element is consent agenda. With consent agenda, items such as minutes and written reports such as financials, compliance reports, dashboard, strategic priority, updates are all handled with one action. It's a way to move through routine items more quickly and allow the meeting time to be used for discussion of more important issues. Even though there may not be discussion about these items, it's really important that board members still carefully review and understand the material. Before the action is taken on the consent agenda, the board chair should ask if any board member would like to have any item removed from the consent agenda to the regular agenda, which would then provide an opportunity to ask questions or have discussion. But if no items are asked to be removed, that can just all be handled at one time by one action. A third element of good process is to expect that board members have read the material. This may seem self-evident, but for some boards, it does require some repetition for board members to get used to this idea, if that hasn't been the expectation. For discussion and action items, you want to give an overview of the topic, but be sure not to go into all of the detail that's in the packet. Just assume that board members have read the material. A fourth element of good process is no last-minute agenda items. And this goes back to good planning when the agenda is developed. If there's thought put into that, most things will have been considered in advance. The problem with last-minute additions is that it affects the time that's already been allocated to other topics. So it affects the amount of time that can be used in the meeting, or it affects whether the meeting can end on time. It also, throwing last-minute material at board members doesn't give them a chance to adequately read it or process it, and you will not get their best input if there's not adequate time for that. If something does come up at the last minute, and it does, typically the executive will need to bring something up. The chair and executive should agree together on how the agenda should be rearranged, and then that should be announced at the beginning of the meeting on how the agenda will be changed. Executive sessions are another process element for providing space for sensitive topics to be raised. The staff are typically dismissed by the chair, usually at the end of the meeting. An executive session, perhaps the executive may call an executive session to give space to share confidentially. Often personnel issues would be handled in executive session. It also may be an opportunity for board members to ask a question of a sensitive nature. And very rarely a board will go into executive session without the executive. And if the board does do that, it's really important for the chair to fill in the executive immediately after the meeting on the nature of the discussion. Things may need to be kept confidential, but the last thing you want to do is have the board go into an executive session and for the executive to not hear anything back. If the board would take an action in executive session, and again, this would not be real normal that there would be, but if it did, it is the responsibility of the board secretary to take minutes and record that action. So that is something that sometimes gets overlooked. So it's a function of the board secretary since there are no staff in the meeting. The third P for productive meetings is participation. For the chair, participation primarily means facilitation of the meeting, keeping the group on topic, keeping the discussion moving, make sure everyone has an opportunity to speak, and make sure the outcome or the decision is clear. Three issues which are pretty common for chairs to have to manage are not enough talking, too much talking, or getting into operations. If there are some of the board who haven't spoken to a topic, it may be helpful to say, there are some we haven't heard from, or are there other thoughts or questions? If there are some who are dominating the discussion, it may be helpful to say, we've heard from some of you. Are there other perspectives from those who haven't yet spoken? Or if the discussion veers into problem solving for operations, the chair might say, we want to be sure we focus on giving staff guidelines and principles that will help them carry out the appropriate planning or response, to try to give the board a little bit of redirection out of that operational talking. So another element of participation is that all board members should come prepared. Remember, having read the packet carefully. A well-prepared board member will often have notes in their packet or notes in their notebook with questions or comments that they would like to make. Every board member should actively participate. Board members have different expertise. They were invited to be on the board for a particular perspective that they bring. So you do want those perspectives brought into the discussion. Over the years, I've talked with many new board members, and I always encourage them to build their governance muscle or build their comfort level by simply holding themselves accountable to speaking up in every board meeting. Even a new person can ask about an acronym, and I guarantee there will be older board members who would be glad you did that, or offer an affirmation, but just develop the practice of speaking up and having your voice heard. It's also good for board members to check their own behavior and be sure you're allowing others to speak. And if your point's been made, bite your tongue and listen to what others have to say. Staying attentive. With many boards going to online board packets, it's easy to get distracted with email or even to just chase down some material that was in the discussion. Be respectful to your fellow board members and to the staff and to the mission of the organization by staying attentive to the conversation in the room. The role of staff in the board meeting, the executive's role is generally to provide the big picture, set the stage for discussions, fill in information. Staff participation varies a lot among different organizations, depending on the culture of the organization or maybe even the life cycle of the organization, how long people have been there or where they are in the process of organizational development. Some organizations have all the senior team members in the room, maybe at the table or maybe in the back of the room. Other organizations keep it tight with only the executive, maybe executive assistant or the CFO possibly. It can be really useful for the board to have staff present to answer questions. It can be useful for staff to understand the board's perspective on some topic. The thing to guard against is too much staff participation can really help move the board to get into operational detail that's not where they should be. It's a good idea for the executive to check in with the board, maybe with the governance committee, about how to handle staff presence. If you would like to make changes with a board that you're part of, here are 5 things your board can do for more productive use of meeting time. Number 1, set the stage with new board members. When they come on, tell them what's expected in their preparation. Tell them that you will expect that they have read the material, and encourage them to speak up in the meeting. Let them know that their voice is welcome even as they're new. For people who are actually new to serving on a board, it may be helpful to explain the board's role as being focused on governance, policy, strategy, rather than giving advice to the staff. So a little education may be helpful if it's someone's first time on a board. A second thing you can do is to build social glue among the board members. This helps to increase their comfort and trust with each other. And you can do this by having a social time before or after the meeting with refreshments or a meal, by rotating doing an opening meditation. This is a way to give insight into different people's points of view and interests. You might have an annual social gathering, or when you include a brief profile of all the board members in the board packet. Or when someone new joins the board, take a little bit of extra time to get to know that person. Invite them to introduce themselves so you can kind of hear about it in their own voice. A third thing boards can do is regular self-assessment. And this is doing surveys, but also then talking about the surveys. 2 types of surveys. One is a regular meeting assessment. Just at the end of each meeting, just a very brief conversation, or a written survey that then gets reviewed by the governance committee or maybe the chair and the executive. You can ask in this sort of brief survey, did we talk about the important things? Did we all participate? Did we use our time wisely? And then bring that back. Learn every time what you can from how that was. MHS encourages boards to do a regular self-assessment, and one that includes genuine conversation about how the board functions. MHS has a really good board self-assessment tool. It's available for no cost to members, and it's a modest cost for clients of MHS Consulting and other nonprofits. The most important thing is to take a look at the assessment results and talk about it, to use them. Sometimes you need to talk about it for more clarification about how people responded, or to change something about how the board is functioning, or to develop a board education or development plan. The final thing to do is to educate the board for upcoming decisions. This again goes back to good planning, to planning ahead. If there is a complex topic, rather than providing reams of information in one board meeting, to perhaps break it apart into different topics and let the board process it multiple times before a big decision would need to be made. This gives the board a better chance to make a meaningful and educated decision. So why does it matter at the end of the day whether board meetings are productive? I think effective board meetings contribute to good decision making. If you have the right information, you have enough time to discuss it, the board can make its best decisions. The second reason I think having good board meetings is because good board members are in demand, and you want to be known for having a board meeting that's productive, effective, where everyone's voice is valued, and that people's time is respected. Thank you for listening. Just checking my notes here. Thank you for listening. I think we do have time for questions. If there's anything more that you would like to know or something that I didn't touch on. Lila, have we had any questions come in yet?
Thank you, Mim. We do have a couple questions coming in. Again, we have plenty of time here for your questions, so please feel free to submit those using the Q&A button there. I'll go ahead and introduce the first question here. Mim, we have a participant asking, can you tell us about the role of committee chairs in the board meeting?
Yeah, most boards have a couple of committees, maybe 2 or 3. Often finance and governance are key committees. And some organizations rely a lot on staff to present topics in the board meeting that were processed in a committee. I think it's a really good idea to have the committee chair present the topic in the board meeting so that it is clearly owned by the board and that the staff are available to answer questions, but actually it's the board member themselves who bring the topic up and lead the discussion and process it that way.
Thank you. We also have a participant asking to see or hear about the 3 Ps again. So I'm going to go back to that slide, and if you would just give us a refresher here on the 3 Ps.
You bet. So the 3 Ps, I found there were a lot of other Ps I could have chosen, but I chose these 3 Ps of planning, process, and participation. I really believe that planning is the foundation, and no matter how often your board meets, whether it's monthly or whether it's quarterly, those are the 2 most common times, or maybe it's 6 times a year, having some routine about that planning helps to provide the best, the way to strategically make sure that you allocate the right amount of time for topics, and also that you have the right material in advance. Process, that's about how the meeting itself functions, and that really falls a lot to the board chair for managing the process of how information is presented and how it's done in such a way that maximizes the use of the board's time. I think one of my most frustrating experiences is always when I'm sitting in a board meeting, whether I'm the board member or whether I've sat in as an observer with many board meetings with MHS, but it's always frustrating to me when almost the only people who ever talk are the staff. And so good process would say it really ought to be more the board members speaking, because they're your volunteer advisors, and you bring them together to get their best wisdom. And so you want to be sure that they actually have plenty of time to speak. Participation goes along with that. Is also responsibility of board members to be prepared in such a way that they can participate by asking questions or making observations. So those are the 3 Ps: planning, process, and participation.
Thank you, Mim. I think we have time for one more question here. Before I share that question, we did have another question from someone wondering if we would share the webinar slides, and we will be happy to do that at the end of the webinar. You'll receive the PowerPoint through the email that you registered with. If for some reason you're joining today but didn't have a chance to register, you can email MHS and I'll put up a contact slide here and we'll be glad to provide those to you. So we'll close with one more question here. I know the chair is to facilitate discussion. How much should the board chair be involved in presenting his or her opinion on an agenda item under discussion?
That's a good question. As a rule, serving as the chair means that you take a step back from participation in the discussion, that you are focused much more on getting others to participate in the discussion. So as a rule, then the chair might, if the chair has something to say because of their unique contribution or because a perspective hasn't been shared, that might be offered late in the game rather than being the first person to speak. I think that would be a good rule of thumb for a chair to find out whether others would offer the perspective that you might be thinking of sharing or the question that you might have. So it does kind of take the chair out of discussion for the most part, and that's just one of the functions. It doesn't mean the chair can't participate or is silent, but their main role should be focusing on process. That's one reason it's okay to share the chair role, so that one person is not always in that facilitator role, so that every few years that person has a chance to rotate into the regular board roster.
Thank you, Mim. We did receive one more question here, which I think we'll have time to answer briefly. How do you know organizationally whether a monthly or quarterly board meeting is best?
I know that some organizations are required to meet monthly depending on your industry. How do you know? I think you talk about whether the information that you need to process is timely in such a way that you have to actually meet every 30 days. I would say for most organizations, it isn't necessary, particularly those with that are large enough to have pretty sophisticated professional staff who can manage things on a monthly basis. Smaller organizations sometimes meet more often because in some cases, board members are providing more oversight of more operational types of things. I think the most common, within MHS, I think the most common number of board meetings is 6 and 4 might be about equal. We did a survey a few years back about that. But again, like with most things, I'm gonna say you should talk about it. You should discuss it together. Board members will have different experience from other boards they've been part of. If you find that you have a lot of material that just needs the board's information but not discussion, then you may be in a situation where you're having too many board meetings.
Great. Thank you so much, Mim, for an engaging discussion, and thanks to our guests who are joining in and participating, asking great questions. Please feel free to email at the info@mhsonline.org, or feel free to reach out directly to Mim with any additional questions. We do look forward to connecting with you again soon. Please hold November 20 of this year for our next webinar. We will be hearing from Elisa Miller, who is Director of MHS Consulting. Visit our website, mhsonline.org, for updates or to subscribe to our eConnections mailing list, where we will post details about this next webinar and also about other upcoming events. Thank you so much and have a great day.